I will introduce Matt to you guys. Matt is a multidisciplinary collaborator and co-conspirator, which I'm very curious to hear what this means. Matt is currently a PhD candidate for a lot of things in the visual, applied, and spatial arts at the
Konstfack University of Arts, Crafts, and Design. Lots of words.
Matt's practice is based in polydisciplinamory, which they will explain later, hopefully, or in questions, entangled making, curating, writing, collaborating, performing, and the list goes on. So I think I will just give the word to you, and you will explain and give a quite big peek into your artistic practice.
Will do my best.
Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here on this warm, lovely evening where we want to be outside. Yeah, there's going to be some video and stuff. It is always impossible for me to cram my whole practice into something these days. So I'm going to attempt to do the best I can. We'll do a little bit of a theoretical walk together. You'll see some images during that time of work. I don't really speak about how the work is made or what it is or what you would think of the work commonly, as I view the work as a material to make what I consider in my research as the work. But with that being said, before I give any talk, I always return to a reflexive piece that Wu Tsang wrote, contemplating performing a very sensitive piece based around Paris's burning. How does one talk about, show, and expose complex issues of underrepresented bodies? So I borrow from Tsang when they have asked their audience before performing, if you want to witness this, please first recognize we exist. In order to fall apart as complex beings, we need first to be able to live. I speak from the perspective of a white settler, a colonial body. In this talk, I cannot speak for anyone beyond my own experience and interpretations. I am a trans, non-binary, and neurodivergent body, but those I work with, learn from, and have built kinship with bring their own histories and lived experiences. So in this talk, be conscious that I'm only speaking from my position of acquired knowledge. Why craft? What is craft? That repetition which I find in all aspects of my work, that constant looping and revisiting is not a repetition that defines absurdity, but instead is an action of craft that keeps me with craft. What is craft? A question I often pose to students in the classroom. It is not of interest to produce a singular definition, but to awaken that craft is defined through its plurality. It becomes a way of looking with, a companion. Craft, perhaps, is the simplest given and the hardest word to describe. Is the speed and sound okay for everybody? I can be a fast-talking American. Just shout at me if I go too fast. It sometimes feels like a I know it when I see it type of situation. It is a term that is subjective, personal, cultural, and field and format shifting. At this time, I find myself gravitating to two useful unpackings of craft. One by Ifkhar Dadi in the Prince Claus Journal, who states, "What is craft? The word has a complex history and equally complex associations. Crafting is a material process, as a skill by which material product is created, but also as an immaterial skill or practice by which a service is offered. Indeed, crafts today can be seen as a medium through which some of the most significant issues of contemporary life are articulated." Dadi, for me, so clearly is admitting the complexity of defining craft. It shifts meaning as it shifts geographies of time, place, and history. I'm most intrigued by Dadi's use of the word service, a word that can immediately imply a place at a lower hierarchy, an act of servitude. When what I gather from this quote is that craft as a term is a useful companion to see what is providing something to get to something else, to elicit a transformation. Craft becomes a bridge or a ladder. It is, as a term, a tool, a material, and a companion. The second piece of writing I always turn to currently is from Nicholas Shang's practice-based PhD thesis from Gothenburg in Worldwide Workshop, The Craft of Noticing. He states, "I'm interested in boundary crossing, in merging different knowledges, skills, and tools. This attitude has affected the way I understand craft, moving away from the self-reliance implied by traditional studio-based craft practices and towards an understanding of craft as a discipline that in itself is extremely elastic in terms of propositions and positions, a craft that is always in flux and in a supplemental position. The same qualities, elasticity, adaptability, fluidity, apply to what the space of craft, where and how craft is learned, produced, made, known, discussed, passed on, may look like today. Nicholas Shang often focuses his work looking at the post-industrial context, how craft is in relation to production, digital technologies, and discourses of sustainability. I find my own research now in relation to Nicholas Shang's statement by looking at how craft is used relationally to movement and geography. It takes craft as something to be with, a companion as one does research, or becomes it. I'm interested in asking, how does craft shift or contribute to conversations of mapping, assemblage, and the constructions of solidarity? This is done through a method of cruising, a way to follow what theorist Eric Rogoff refers to as a vibration, by letting the work produce the research. To become the research allows for a place of play and wandering. Cruising is directly related to desire, as it is about moving and pausing, resting or stopping whenever there is an impulse. Within my practice, it is also the acceptance of what the output of research could look like, being nimble and open to different forms of dissemination through writing, object making, and curating, all of which I see as actions of assemblage towards building a more sustainable practice. If systems and methods of institutional research have been built out of the will of what writer Bell Hooks refers to as white, cisgendered, heteropatriarchal men, that's a mouthful, then the rest of us deserve a space to explore and develop the methods that work for us. It is placing craft as a way of looking, a tool to animate the archive, a particular way of learning I frame as the continuous, repeated action with the material or process which enables us to unpack the histories of material, the labor in the production of objects, and the possibilities of use. It is a way that could arguably be learned in many ways, but I feel is accelerated through the repetitive actions found in craft-based practices, which allows us to consider geology, extraction, human labor, economy, and sustainability. Craft becomes a way to see each other and the systems that have been built to keep us apart. One of the many things craft has provided me is a rich trove of words, poetics, and metaphors. It has become an attention-stabilizing game in my mind to see how these phrases and the likes of craft, crafting, crafted are deployed among the pages of various fields' texts. There's a potential here to unpack what I often call the places where craft is in the red, to encourage the tracing of trajectories that break outside national borders and boundaries, to see craft in larger mappings. It is a way to see the fluidity pointed out by Ifkar Dadi as a way to go between frames and to connect spaces once thought of as separate. This thinking positions craft in a place of responsibility for participating in building and in turn destroying worlds, past, present, and possible. Craft has a relation to industrialization, materiality, and manufacturing, used to create health and harm. Craft, when approached this way, requires taking responsibility for where and how we got ourselves to this point in the world today. It summons the messy places most institutions want to keep under the rug. These include race, sex, gender, and anything else one can connect to a body. The body is not neutral. It has a shape, a color, an ability, a disability. A body is locatable on a map, those defined by nation states, equatorial lines, money, and power. Craft for me becomes a tool to be with and to create historiography, to avoid the singularity of history and the pitfall that James Baldwin and Margaret Mead state, that what we call history is perhaps a way of avoiding responsibility for what has happened, is happening in time. Craft provides vocabulary for me to see the tracks in the text I have come into deep relationships with, tracing the paths of mastery, shattering, home, and use, to drag these ideas back to my home and entangle them with the personal, as to quote Sarah Ahmed, the personal is theoretical. To use my place as a way to work with craft, to animate. Animation is a term that I have found productive to turn to, thinking with theorists such as Sarah Ahmed and Eric Rogoff, is a way to create a life and movement. I've become a magpie, picking up theorists, thinkers, singers, and other sources found while cruising daily life. Picking from seemingly disparate places to make assemblages, as Walter Benjamin's Parisian flaneur confronts a single field as a city becomes an arcade, and moving through it, he can transform space into time. How Diane Chisholm in Queer Constellations has taken the flaneur and unpacks the possibilities of the things one collects and how, when arranged, can become constellations of meaning. These, as Sarah Ahmed points out too in Living a Feminist Life, are materials. Using a reference of building a house, there's an acknowledgement that pulling from feminism, indigenous, Black, and queer scholarship may not produce the stability of a proper, sturdy house. But there is possibility in these texts, poems, and narratives that allow for world-making, for proposals to live differently. At the same time, I find use in using citations that come with problematic baggage. It is not a wedding to these writers and creators, but for me, they become a tool. Using the sources that are part of the master's house of neoliberal capitalistic agendas or that support white cis male heteropatriarchy have a possibility with craft to be retooled. These tools, which at times have been used to control and dominate, can inversely have the ability to think in possible futures. As Lewis R. Gordon and Jane Anna Gordon in the book Not Only the Master's Tools states, there are those who use those tools, developed additional ones, and built houses of their own on more or less generous soil. It is our view that the proper response is to follow their lead, transcending rather than dismantling Western ideas through building our own houses of thought. When enough houses are built, the hegemony of the master's house, in fact, mastery itself, will cease to maintain its imperial status. Shelter needn't be the room offered by such domination. I could talk for days on the term mastery alone. Gordon here, using the well-known words of Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And they're taking the master's tools and using it as a fulcrum to leverage a new possibility of space. Craft, as unpacked here, is a possible tool, both metaphorically and in physicality. It is not a matter of sidestepping or ignoring the problems that come with craft, and instead proposes a possibility to retool or reuse what is already here, to think of other ways we have lived and could live by shifting how we are with craft. Looking back, my current work stems from the encounter with the Fick archive located within the Royal Army Museum, which is under the Royal Palace in Stockholm, Sweden, which I encountered for the first time while I was a resident with IASPIS, the Swedish Government Arts Office in Stockholm in 2016. Fick collected books in the late 1800s and early 1900s, centering on all things manly, meaning mostly war, sports, weaponry, and fighting. Women only appear in, let's say, a graceful way as Amazons within two texts in the entire collection. Other than that, they are kind of a joke and storytelling, sadly. In these texts, there are military journals for tactical movements and displays of armor and weaponry. I can see a bit more clearly looking back that this is a point I began to make sense and entangle this archive with Bell Hook's words on queerness and calling forth the imagination for the restructuring and re-envisioning of self and possibility. I'm intrigued by craft, its histories and active processes of tool-making, tools that have been used for good and the worst atrocities within our histories. It's asking, how can we be thinking with craft? A way to see land, extraction, material, labor, economy, use, and waste. If the object is thought of as material instead of a finished work, how can meaning be made by simply reassembling the material, shifting its geography and the bodies present in ever-shifting assemblages? So this is a woven tapestry that is based off the war diagrams found in the armory, and then their vintage German cameos in which one can play war and move them around on the board, or one can become part of the board and wear one or multiple if one wishes. This is a way of thinking out of the capitalist production of goods with the intention of economic profit, to retool the language of craft today and the possibilities it has relating to the body. Craft for me always requires the consideration of the body. This is why I feel it is ideal to think with in relationship to queer, Black, and Indigenous feminisms, the constant shattering of the self as we live and the rearranging and changing we go through. It asks us to change speeds, sometimes slowing down and spending time with material. Carving is seen here on the left from a single piece of wood, or exploring the potential of developed systems such as the woven leather on the right. Thinking with old poetics to develop new material combinations and ways of working. Again, I'm not going to talk about every specific kind of theme within them, but if you want me to go back after during the questions, I'm happy to explain in detail any of this work. Taking the physical of craft, cycling it into images which are printed to become objects again, melding the two together to assemble and reassemble possible installations or constellations to see what new meanings emerge. Constructing with the intention to shatter, allowing pieces to go with different bodies to different places. Rearranging the pieces with the wondering if they will ever possibly be put back together after living lives with others. Allowing titles to change, reflecting the ability as a body to change names, and dating the work in the moment of its encounter, as the experience of the encounter is where I ground the term work in, as the objects are considered material. The work dances in metaphors, relating to how we choose to enter the world each day, taking different pieces with us. Some we choose knowing our plans and where we are going, and others strapped to us not by choice but by the world around us. I use the term cruising for this method, following Black feminists writing on the right to wander, to create through desire and joy. Continually oscillating between object and image, making, capturing, printing, cutting, and recapturing, repeating these processes over and over. Salvaging, mimicking, and restoring, constantly questioning objectness and fixedness. Releasing the private into chaos, letting others join and interpret, questioning authorship. My way of thinking with craft is that it never has singular authorship. Craft for me is an activation or transmission, holding those we have learned from and trusting our hands. Essentially, it is a form of citation. This also makes it impossible for me to have solo shows, and have chosen now to claim those things on my resume as not so solo shows. Realizing that we are in circular systems, ones that things come from somewhere else, we interact with them and then depart, going our separate ways, but still continuing on, continuing to make other things, to be worn, to be used, to fall apart, or to be held in perpetuity. My current practice is interested in developing spaces and exhibitions of possible activation, grappling with the places in life containing the expectation of performing. Valenti non fit injuria is Latin in US law referencing for hockey originally, meaning a willing participant cannot claim harm. How does this apply to life? When are we willing participants and when can we claim injury? How do we create kin to hold each other in these spaces? Within these exhibitions, there is a tool wall. During the development of protective padding in sports, a catcher in reference to protective gear in baseball proclaimed that a man who uses these devices for protection is using the tools of ignorance, implying that to protect oneself is not manly, that facing the risk of injury head-on is necessary, and to protect oneself is signaling weakness. Or, as it also might be read, that only an ignorant man would take such a high-risk position on the field. The wall is constantly rearranged and shifts in each showing, letting objects come in and out, acting as a tool shed, hooks forged from medical instruments designed to hold the body together during surgery, hooks found in my father's garage, and hooks that those that work in gallery spaces have hoarded for their unique individuality that they've just been waiting to use. The third space within these exhibitions are places of rest. Training outside the academy through apprenticeships, I have learned to work with leather through antique coach car trimming, as well as Persian, Peking, and Kalim rug restoration. Picking up objects already in cycles of materiality and working with them towards possibilities. As another note, I do not use any materials. Some people assume that the rugs have indigenous connotations. They are all made for Western markets. Um, I do not touch prayer rugs or anything that is culturally significant. Finding used military equipment turned into play objects found in summer camps and used by Boy Scouts, and discarded or unusable objects to put in dialogue to find different meanings. Searching for places of activation and rest. How do we create space for rest? How do we make home even when outside of our houses? What does it mean to enter public space with our gestures? When are they performative? How do we care for ourselves before, during, and after their deployment? When is silence productive or necessary for survival? And when does expression need to be unpacked and unloaded into space? This way of working for me has naturally progressed to working collaboratively, primarily through material-based practices. In this example, Edward Cabral was a Latinx artist that is now, I believe they're based in New York, originally based from Chicago. And I have worked on a series of portraits with him based off of parade armor, using predominantly materials found in baking sweets and cakes, such as icing and cookies as seen here. After briefly meeting Cabral at an art exhibition online, after briefly meeting in person at an exhibition and continuing a conversation online, we began to explore how our work could collide together. Edward is a sculptor and pastry chef whose work explores colonization and minoritization in relationship to food, baking, and cake decorating. Working with Christine Fielder, a photographer, we followed the photographic history of using the gaze of another to form edited images of our bodies and other performers. What results is a series of tapestries that are created through the same process as blankets for mass tourist markets and memories for grandma's couch. These tapestries are paired with jewelry made from everyday hardware store materials that mimic small sweets and cakes. All of this is displayed together and incorporated with the performance of the consumption of actual cake, which constructs a conversation on the parallels of consuming both cake and gender, which at times is craved or desired, but can often result in rotten teeth and nausea from overconsumption and indulgence. The second collaboration I'm highlighting here is the work that I do with Karl Olofberg. Karl is a choreographer focusing around masculinity and gender construction. I was first connected to Karl through a contact as he had seen my work at the Architecture and Design Museum in Stockholm, Sweden. The beginning interaction resulted in a multi-year loan of work to go on tour with dance company Spin, which is an alternative way of making money through galleries rather than selling work. I loan work out for performance through my galleries. Dance company Spin focuses on working with differently abled and disabled dancers for a more inclusive professionalization of dance. This opportunity has provided a way to make and see my work on bodies that I otherwise would have never explored. I just have a short trailer for this. As Skirt Power continues to travel, Karl and I have continued to move forward, having completed a residency with the National Program for Dance in Stockholm to continue a joint investigation into body movement, fluids, objects, and masculinity. In our project Spit, we integrated a research project around the possibilities of spit as a material of animation within the Royal Armory Museum in Stockholm. playing the manipulated recordings of us physically spitting on the museum floors, creating dripping caves and loud, blunt gunshot-like noises, which were played on continuous loops throughout the museum, a mechanism used to consider the body in or with the objects on display, a reminder of the lives that are not physically present in the museum by inducing a resonant haunting, raising awareness to the sweat and spit held within. The sound is accompanied by a series of images and videos taken by Jennifer Drutzrun, played at various points throughout the museum, leading you into the farthest vaulted room on the main floor. I don't have any of these videos in the lecture itself, but I do have them if anyone wants me to play one or two of them. Within this space, objects worn during a 30-minute endurance performance are displayed and stored, referencing historic padding found under armor and crafting face pieces, referencing various aspects of saliva and spit. During the length of the exhibition, free ticketed performances occurred starting at the entrance of the museum and started by us as performers physically carrying each other while connected by garments through the vaulted rooms to get to the end of the museum while the audience followed us walking through the vitrines. Within the final vaulted room, a 30-minute durational performance occurs, which requires a process of communication, recalling life histories of spit and exploring labor and the queer body within the museum. A third and final collaboration I will touch on is with artist Murat Anasara, who's a Sami artist and author based in Gadogeno. Her project Pile of Sami, which was presented at Documenta 14, initiates a conversation around indigenous rights and present-day colonialism. In short, Pile of Sami started off as a reaction to government forced slaughter of the Sami people's reindeer herds in Finnmark, in northern Norway. Sara's brother, Jovit Santasara, went to court to fight the Norwegian government, and Sara engaged in this process through artistic expressions. Pile of Sami can be considered both as an artwork and as an artistic movement, and was first presented as a mountain of freshly slaughtered reindeer heads crowned by a Norwegian flag at its peak, and installed in front of the Indre Finnmark District Court in Sápmi in northern Norway in February of 2016. Since, the project has branched out into a number of works and events that details with Sami rights and what Sara has described as a new colonialism, enforced through administrative and political structures and legislation from the Norwegian government. In Documenta 14, Pile of Sami was shown as a curtain of 400 reindeer skulls with subtle references to the Sami flag. This work reappeared outside of the Norwegian parliament during her brother's trial that in December 2017 reached the Supreme Court of Oslo, and has since gone on to reach the UN court case, which the verdict on the UN was that Norway is infringing on indigenous rights, but Norway has still maintained that they refuse to acknowledge the verdict. Through showing and talking about these works, Sara was raising awareness about the current situation for the indigenous people in Sápmi and what was and still is happening in the Norwegian legal system. And this is a piece that's in reference to, as we saw, the mayoral or the other collars. This is one that she made for the Sami people. Sara invited me to collaborate after she spoke on her own work, and I moderated a discussion in Munich. We didn't actually even speak in person at that time. It was only later Sara emailed me saying she felt some kind of connection in our shared convictions. While in residence with Praxis Oslo on gender and adornment supported by Norwegian Craft, I independently traveled to Gadogeno, where Sara and I further explored our common ground, meeting as an indigenous and queer body. Left over from Anasara's project shown in Documenta were around 50 reindeer bone porcelain skulls. The concept of this material stems from the eradication of the American buffalo to starve off Native Americans from land that was desired for colonization. The bones were shipped overseas and ground into porcelain. This process has been replicated by Anasara as her brother continues to fight within the court cases as he is soon to go bankrupt. When Anasara and I work together, there's a speak of the we. This we is one of understanding we have developed together, a process which could not have happened without sharing space in the land that cannot speak for itself, or at least be heard by colonial ears and asked to be protected. There's also the recognition of the danger of the we, a small loaded word that comes into my practice daily. It is what requires the daily reminders of staying woke and to check internalized racism, sexism, homophobia, privileges, and especially the white savior complex. Oftentimes, the danger of the we, as Catherine Yusoff states in A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, is that this we negates all responsibility for how the wealth of that geology was built off the subtending strata of indigenous genocide and erasure, slavery, and carceral labor, and evades what that accumulation of wealth still makes possible in the present. Lest we forget that the economies of geology still largely regulate geopolitics and modes of naturalizing, formalizing, and operationalizing ongoing settler colonialism. This project is further developed through a commission by the Norwegian National Museum to create 200 custom 3D printed steel necklaces scanned from the porcelain skulls, which are now available at the museum store. This allows for another layer of access into the project, from large sculptural works to wearable art jewelry and now to production-based work. It also points to a cruel irony of selling this collaborative work, as well as showing Marat Anasara's work as part of the permanent collection of the National Museum of Norway, while the human rights violations are still not recognized nationally despite the UN's verdict of the infringement of indigenous rights by Norway. As with making collaborations, the function of writing and curating has become crucial within my practice. It has become a space to explore theory and ideas developed through my practice-based research and seeing how they exist outside of me, participating in the authorship of object making. It has allowed for kinship making and dialogues globally that otherwise would be difficult in building. Publishing through publicly accessible platforms has become critical in my view. I'm interested in how we can expand our conversations to de-insulate them from the academy, a way to engage with publics to create awareness of the importance and necessity of maintaining craft programs, not only for their value in developing ways of making, but also thinking and seeing the world. If you are interested in any of my writing, it is a requirement as a researcher to upload it to Diva, so anything that can be publicly accessible is located there. And to wrap things up, I don't really need the sound on this. That's okay. This is the work I've been recently working on. I've been thinking a lot about adornment and appearance and the expectations of spectacle placed on certain kinds of bodies to perform the desire to sometimes just be left alone, to live and love as we want, looking the way we want for self-love and pleasure and not to just put on a show. This work that is being developed to join the horde summons the dance floor and entangles it in the war room, and as well as classical still life portraiture, finding parallels in the possibilities and potentials for the queer body. It is the repetition of thousands of stabs to create this something, the process which allows the time to meditate, cry, and laugh, holding and reflecting on life, desire, kin, and the constant beat of the news that often feels like death by 1,000 stabs, jabs, pricks, stings, and still somehow we manage to keep dancing. With each piece, material variance has increased, using precious materials and semi-precious stones, sequins, salvaged garment components, medical ports from recent health crises, reworked costume jewelry, and most recently hand-fabricated lampwork glass. A grouping of this work will be shown during the Lisbon Biennale for jewelry as an installation crossing the dance floor and the grids found in the Armory Archive, creating a grid plan and an opportunity to dance outside the lines. Thank you.
Are there any questions or curiosities?
The room of
An
silence.
understanding of this discipline, this difficult word.
Polydisciplinamory? That's a whole thing on its own. Polydisciplinamory. It comes from Natalie Lovelace, who's really big in Canada, and she uses research creation instead of artistic research. And it is the value, and this is where a lot of Norwegian artistic research started, Crispin as well. It is not being wedded to a particular field. So it is the ability to exist within the margin or the middle and speak to different disciplines simultaneously. So hence the polydisciplinamory. And so that also highlights the precarity of the artist further.
What's the difference then between polydisciplinary and multidisciplinary? Is there a difference? Or?
What multidisciplinary would imply existing within the discipline, where polydisciplinary is not claiming to be within a singular discipline. That would be the easiest, yeah.
Would craft be one of those disciplines then?
The way I use craft, I would say yes.
And what is lacking in art or jewelry or costume, or why did you, of all those directions, take craft?
I view craft as a companion. I think you can look at art. Craft as a word doesn't exist in many cultures, and it evolves as a term during industrialization, right? Because the only thing you had before industrialization was craft. So you just did what you did because you had to do it. You needed a cup, you made a cup. So craft itself is not an ideal term, and it's tied up in this mastery and this whole kind of muck and mire, which is why I think it's an amazing thing to work with. But I also feel like the way I use craft, like we can look at painting, right? Like I'm over this art versus craft thing. I don't know how many people really want that. But without craft, right, you don't have painting, because one needs to make paint and one need, unless we're completely conceptual, but then one is crafting thought, right? So it becomes craft for me is a larger, broader term that is learned through our materials, but it has an extreme value culturally. And I mean, in the US, law researchers are largely come from craft art and music because they think alternatively. So I think institutionally, we really need to think of how we explain the value of what we do beyond the capitalistic drive to produce new objects to sell to a very elite group of people who can afford these things and usually aren't wearing them, and then they go in drawers. And so it really comes from a frustration with that system. There's nothing wrong with that system. I just think that we need to think in multiplicities for stability rather than the kind of narrow mindset that we've really put ourselves in.
Do you think that the craft thinking and the craft interest by the younger generation right now is coming back? Because in my early days, creating sweaters by the wool of the sheep for my father, we did that in the old days. But I have the feeling that it's coming back now by the younger people to find this love for making and craft.
Yeah, I think COVID had a lot to do with that too. Yeah, but there's like a really tricky thing of nostalgia in there, and like this idea of doing anything by hand, and it's actually more sustainable, and sometimes it's not, and it's still not necessarily ethical, right? And like these ideas are still have to be considered. And I think there is a tendency to jump to that as a way of skirting these conversations, but they still need to be had. Like, what does it mean to own an animal? Do you actually own, like, there's no getting out of the world we're in today. It just, you can't make something and not think about it in my world.
Question about authorship, because you were saying like craft is not a single authorship.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my shows, I'm not claiming it to be a solo show, but then you're so dominant in your shows, like your body is there, very large images. You're also naked most of the time. Right? So you're very present. So how is this balanced?
It's really present, I think, in like what someone would consider like the non-collaborative work. There's a lot of my body present in it. My body, though, entered kind of later on. I was using a lot of other people's bodies at first, and then I stopped because I was like, do I have the right to use these bodies? These are bodies of different genders, races, sexes, ages. So then I need to have that same vulnerability. Just because of that work, I think when I work with other people, they tend to have me want to do that as well. Like the image of the big jaw collar is taken in the north, and that's in an attic, and it was very, very cold. But that was Anna's request. Like I wasn't like, I need to be nude. And the nudeness really comes from like when I first started taking images, I had jeans on and then it looked like a Levi's ad campaign. And it just starts to look really capitalistic. So like getting naked was like, and as someone who has body dysmorphia, it was a challenge to be like, let's take ownership of that practice. And as I age, it is still a struggle. There's some new photos that have been done that I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I want people to see these. But yeah, it's a dialogue with everything, and it's same thing with the armor. And then regarding authors, I mean, I don't really care about my objects. It's really terrible to say, but like they're all in boxes and they get thrown around, and I'm like the worst caretaker of my things. I just think of them as material. So like my body just becomes a material in that way, and it's more about that discourse. And I think like asking that question in the exhibition is really more intriguing of like what is visual dominance versus conceptual dominance versus theoretical dominance. Uh, and yeah, but I mean, and all these projects have different underpinnings. And even when I write, there's inverted pay scales based on gender and race, based on the countries we're in. I do not make any money off of Murat Anasara and my collaboration. It all goes to fund legal fees. And I don't speak about that or write about it often because then it becomes a white savior practice. But I think it's important to speak about it, especially in institutional settings of thinking about what does economy actually look like. So often we also write on people's work and those artists don't get paid and everybody has different laws and different things. But I think that's where the co-conspirator comes in of like, what is the goal and objective? So, I mean, Ana Sara is also heavily dominant in that project, but it's also using my practice and jewelry as a way to expand what she's saying. So in a way, she's also using me and my work simultaneously.
Is using the right word or learning?
I mean, I like use. Sarah Achman has that really good book, What's the Use? And like the idea. And it being honest about it, yeah, like use me if you want to like consent, right? Consent is my biggest kink. Like if you consent to being used, do it. But yeah, I mean, if it was malicious, then yeah, no, please don't do that. But I think collaboratively using works for me. But generally, I wouldn't use that word. But in collaboration, I think I would.
Doing a PhD, you have to have a lot of stamina, and I admire that. But in the years that you've been researching, have you seen your topic change? Have you had to fight other fields or?
Yeah. Sweden has very specific laws on artistic research. It's actually set in our laws, which is a beautiful, amazing thing. So we have two types of practice PhD. We have one by scientific and then one purely by artistic practice, which is the one that I'm doing. Yeah, my original one was like very much rooted in using the armory and looking at like gender construction and violence, and because you can trace like the history of ergonomics and everything from this archive. So many ballet, all these things come out of war essentially. Yeah, and then I couldn't get access to it because it was a private collection behind another collection in another collection with a 75-year-old librarian that didn't want COVID. So I could spit on the floor outside the archive, but I wasn't allowed to be in the archive. Yeah, and it really just pivoted from there. And then primarily I work in the dance and choreography department at Escoho, and I've really left the craft area because they have such a different understanding of the body. And so myself and Anna Mlosowski are building a bridge between the two schools for looking at the body and material-based practices versus performative practices, and what we both kind of forgot and remind each other of. So I think that, yeah, I never thought I never set out to do performance. I actually really hate doing it, but the work said I had to, so therefore I did it.
Because I was wondering that, or I want to hear more about how you're working with like queer bodies and your queer identity, which is something very personal or vulnerable, which you mentioned a little bit, and yet your work is very connective or trying to make connections also between different fields. And I wonder how you deal or think about doing this very small, private, yet also very connecting, big, unifying practice.
Oh, that's a big question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really ever like I have an issue with the word queer these days. Because I mean, Bell Hooks says everybody should be queer, so we have to explain ourselves every time we meet. But then Jose Esteban Munoz also says like queerness is never here and now. It always exists within like the past and in the future. And so it's the constant movement towards something. So, like queerness is not a fixed identity in my world in that way. It's the thing that's on the margin, which is what has given me the ability to work with collaborators, is I'm more interested on like the non-dominant narrative rather than queerness as a form of identity politics. When I make, it's definitely there because I'm making it. It is my body making those things. But I think by releasing the object as a material instead of it as an object, really was the crucial point that it opened up so many amazing dialogues. When I did my first master's, it was very singular object, and then I've gotten farther and farther away from that. And the further I move from that, the more engaging and the more opportunity it has. And accepting that we do not have control over our objects. I mean, it's kind of a lie. We make things and we think we know exactly who it's for, but like we have no control over where they go, or if they show up on the news, maybe on a reporter, but maybe also on somebody we really don't want to be associated with. And so like releasing that is a very liberatory process for me, where it's like, I'm done with it. It goes on to its next life. Is that kind of answering where we're going? Or does she want something more specific?
Pleasure. All right. You mentioned that you are uncomfortable performing. Do you mean dancing? Is dancing becoming part of your hobby?
Yeah, it was a big joke when I went back to Jaspis as a dancer. I'm an introvert. That's why I think most people like craft. We like to close the door and do it. Yeah, and then the photos like just are something like I just have a bunch of friends, we close the door, we play some music, I buy some food and drinks, and we take photos. And people were like, "Oh, you're doing performance. Can we book you for performance?" And I was like, I don't do performance, but I need money. So like let's like it's naturally just assumed that way. It just became performative. And then Carl really challenged me because he was like, "Oh, well, let's do this test thing. Cool, me and him behind a door. Oh, let's write this big grant. Okay. Oh, surprise, we're going to do a 40-minute performance in front of hundreds of people." And I was like, "Great. And you're going to stand on my back while I crawl on the floor, and you can't fall down for 40 minutes. And then we're going to drool nonstop for 30 minutes and let people stare at us." Yeah, no, I'm not a dancer. I'm not trained in any of it. I do it because the work demands it. I always say in my practice is if I'm comfortable, I should be questioning why I'm doing it. Especially working with other marginalized people, is if I'm complacent, then there may be some problems with the other people that they might have, and that requires an open conversation with them.
I respect that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
For the interesting lecture. Thank you all for coming.